our friends at the University of Northwestern St. Paul. My name is Kim Cromer, and I am honored to serve as the League's Executive Director. Tonight is a special night as we begin to dig into the 3 topics that have been chosen for this year's options. Certainly, we wish that we were all together celebrating regional championships around the country, but we're grateful for the opportunity to be able to spend some time with a group of people who have been working diligently on your behalf for over 6 months. I'd like to start with a special thank you for the hard work and dedication of this team that you're going to meet tonight and the rest of the team that you'll meet on Thursday night. And I'd like to start with introducing you to the chairman of our debate committee, Dr. Ravi Paul. Dr. Paul has been involved with NCFCA for 12 years and has served in several roles over the years, including the North Carolina State Rep, and he's currently a member of our board of directors. Ravi earned both his MS and PhD in industrial management from Clemson University after completing his BS in mechanical engineering from Bangalore University. He serves as an associate professor of management information systems in the College of Business at East Carolina University. Dr. Paul and his wife Nancy have 5 children, 3 NCFCA alumni, 1 current competitor, and 1 future competitor. An interesting fact that I hope he's not going to test us on tonight is that Dr. Paul speaks 5 languages. So that's exciting, but we hope we're going to go with English tonight, Ravi.
Thank you.
So Ravi, would you tell us a little bit about the resolution process and the goals of NCFCA policy debate to get us started?
Sure would. Thank you for the introduction. It's exciting to see all of you here. It's going to be a fun evening. Thanks for joining us. The 5 languages, one sad part is, other than English, I'm sad that irrespective of the topic chosen this year, none of the other 4 would probably show up in a round since we're not going to be in the Asian continent.
Okay.
But it's exciting. So let me just talk about, first of all, I want to give a huge shout out to the resolution team. It's always a joy and a pleasure to engage with these folks on behalf of the NCFCA. We've had some fun times discussing things, debating things as we got to the stage. So, and I can tell you, one of my sort of criterion that I put on the resolution committee at the beginning of the process is, I say, we want to be excited, and we will be excited irrespective of the topic that's chosen this year. That's kind of what we're going for when we pick out and get to the final 3. And so the process to get there is pretty elaborate. It takes some time. We spend months. And it starts with a collection of ideas. We basically have a spreadsheet that we use to collect all of the ideas that you all send in throughout the year. And also ideas that we come up with from members of the committee. And then it's a multi-step process from there, narrowing down the field to the final 3. And that's based on our own research, discussions, debates, even among the committee. And also, primarily, we use some very important criteria as a filter to narrow down the field. Some of those criteria are compatibility with NCFCA's mission, the relevance of the topic, breadth of the topic, variety, etc. If Mrs. Cromer's latest newsletter addressed some of these and tried to explain some of the criteria that we use. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, please do so. Also, anytime you have an idea that you want us to consider for the next year, please send your suggestions to debatecommittee@ncfca.org. All of those are valuable, and we start, like I said, with those when we begin this process. Now, a particular note, today's purpose for this session is really to provide you content information about each of the three topics. Any rules or debate philosophies kind of discussion are not the topic for today's webinar. They'll be reserved for a different platform, a different venue. Also note that the final wording we hope to have announced early next week, prior to the closure of the voting on May 1st. So you will have the final wording so you know exactly what wording you're actually voting on before you put in your votes. A couple of general notes, admonition really, this one. For families, parents, coaches, just to make a note that we need to use wisdom in deciding if you're comfortable allowing your children to research the topics, knowing that there will be some sensitive material they will find. Unfortunately, these are real world topics, and the likelihood of them seeing something that's sensitive, that's sort of mature, is very high. For example, I'm thinking of human trafficking, drug-related topics will most likely will show up in your research on any of these three topics for this year. We noticed it during our initial research, and we divide up the topics by an individual person who does a sort of a deep dive into the topic. And James, I think, who did the EU topic, you know, made a point to note that that we are aware of that, and that we're not, you know, that we are comfortable with our children being, the likelihood of them coming across that is very high. Speaking of which, please note the white papers that the resolution committee has produced. They're up on the website, and they're available along with the ballot for your voting on the dashboard, the NCFCA dashboard, under surveys. So if you haven't seen those, please, 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 they're right next to it, if I remember correctly, to each topic, and it's a PDF document that you can use to look at each of the topics. Mm-hmm. All right, so specifics for this evening. So the process this evening, we're going to have each of the resolution committee members give a brief presentation on each topic. And once all three are done, we'll have a giveaway and then a time of Q&A for the panel. So I'd ask you to put your questions in the chat box as you hear different speakers. And also, if you would, please, if there is a particular speaker you want to address that question, please put their name along with the question as to which one you would like to address that question. So that's the general process we're going to follow. And I look forward to the time. I look forward to your participation and your questions as well. So without further ado, I'm going to start with, and I'm going to introduce each of the speakers and let them present on their topic, and we'll go in turn to do that. Our first presenter is James Russell, probably not a stranger to a lot of you. James competed for 5 years in the NCFCA. He's coached over 1,000 policy students throughout the last decade. As the director of DFW's Speech and Debate, he has overseen the development of curriculum, including the DFW SD Tools for Team Policy Sourcebook, which is annually created and nationally utilized policy resource. In his free time, James enjoys spending time with his wife, his senior year debate partner, who he admits readily wins every debate, even now. He also loves dogs and wants pictures of yours. So, James, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, hello and good evening, everybody. We are going to have fun tonight. So thank you for taking the time to tune in this evening. Yeah, I only have 10 minutes. Usually I would speak and I would chat and I would just talk, but I promised to stay within 10 minutes this evening. So we have so much to talk about. Let's dive in. So we're going to be chatting about the resolution, which currently reads, resolved, the European Union should substantially reform its immigration policy. Let me start by saying I'm really hyped about this being a resolution choice. I like all three resolution choices. I think this one is fantastic. So as I discuss why I think it's really relevant and why I think it has great breadth and is very easy for you to support, I also want to share with you the excitement that I have for it, because I think this is a fantastic opportunity for everyone, parents, coaches, competitors, the whole spectrum. So let's start by just talking about Europe for a moment. I'm going to give you Europe in a handbasket from a 5,000 foot perspective, going back 2,000 years. Okay, the story of Europe is you have international powerhouses rise up, Spain, Great Britain, France, create these massive empires, amass all this wealth and power, and then they eat themselves alive, literally. Like they destroy themselves from the inside out. If you think about it, it's only been a little over 100 years, and in the last 100 years, there have been 2 world wars fought on European soil that have devastated Europe. So when we talk about something like the EU, you need to have an appreciation for what the EU, the European Union, represents. This is literal centuries of diplomacy and negotiations to forge a partnership between European nations, because they realize if they can get on the same page and they can march to the beat of the same drum, there's a lot of power to be had there, but it's very difficult to do that. The EU as an organization is less than 30 years old. It's not that old. Sometimes, especially when I started researching at the beginning, I admit I thought it was like 60 years old, 70 years old. It's not. It's actually a relatively new organization. But right now, like now, is the critical juncture in the EU's history. Because the EU is either going to tear itself apart, probably within the next 5 to 10 years, or it's going to morph and adapt into something that's very compelling and something that's very strong. So you, as a debater, get to enter into literally like the crossroads for this organization. And immigration is one of the key pivot points. So if you want an idea of how critical immigration is for the EU, I want you to picture 1 million people. Right? That's a lot of people, 1 million people. And I want you to picture every single year for over a decade, 1 million people petition the EU to be let in the EU member states. That is the reality that the EU has been dealing with forever. And so even though it had very idealistic policies for how immigrants would be handled and treated, especially immigrants coming from outside the EU in practice, they've had a lot of trouble accommodating 1 million people on an annual basis. So you get to deal with one of the largest crises that the EU is facing, and you get to get right in the thick of it. So to understand what exactly you'd be talking about, let's look at what the EU's responsibilities are in terms of immigration, okay? So the EU has control over 2 main types of immigration, okay? There's internal immigration, and then there's third-party immigration. Let's talk about internal immigration first. That's when someone who already lives in one of the 27 EU member states wants to go to another EU member state. That's internal immigration. That, for the most part, is pretty unfettered. You don't need a whole lot. Like, you're a member of the EU, you have your EU membership card, you can go wherever you want within the EU. Third-party immigration is when you want to, from any other non-EU state, enter into the EU. That's the type of immigration that's had over 1 million applicants for the last decade plus some. Both of those types of immigration can be further subdivided into what we would call legal and illegal immigration, but in the EU, they call it regular immigration and irregular immigration. The EU deals with both of those things. And because there's been such an influx of people, there have been real issues, but they span 4 main areas. So if you want to write them down to kind of give yourself context, here they are. So the first one is human rights and dignity. When you have 1 million people wanting to enter in your country and you don't have really practical and easy to understand ways to get into the country, you get a backlog. And the EU has a massive backlog to the point where they've actually partnered with countries outside the EU to hold people who want to immigrate to the EU in holding areas until they can finally process their applications. Not only are those holding areas and that entire process really difficult, it's not well managed, which means there's legitimate human rights issues, the biggest of which being human trafficking. A large percentage of known human trafficking happens to people who are making that trek from Africa or Asia trying to get to the EU, and they either get waylaid along the way, or as they're waiting to get into the EU, they get taken then. Or even worse, there's human traffickers in the EU who promise them, hey, like, you know, you came all this way and you know that you can't get in now, but we can get you in, just come work for us. That's a really deplorable system. And the EU has a specific mandate to address that, especially when it comes to the trafficking of women and children. Most academics would agree they failed. You would get to enter in there. We can also talk about security, because once you're in the EU, you can travel anywhere in the EU. That might seem like a good idea, but since all the member states have different processes for granting you membership, that's really upset some people. You can go to some EU member states and, you know, with a wink and a nod, essentially buy your membership, which means you've also bought access to all of the other countries. As you can imagine, the countries with very strict requirements for their membership aren't so pleased about that. That's been a big area of dispute. That's been a driving area of Brexit, by the way. If you think back over the last, 5-6 years where Brexit's been in the news, immigration, that part of immigration was a big deal to the UK authorities. There's also economic stability and the economic output of immigrants. Anytime there's immigration, that's going to affect your workforce. There's a lot of people either concerned or very excited about the impact immigration would have in their countries. And then finally, there's just national sovereignty. There's nations who are very on board with the EU's mission to have a very cohesive policy. And then there's countries that are really pushing back. And because they feel like their voice isn't being represented well within the EU's immigration policy, they're wanting to distance themselves from the EU's immigration policy. So you have this pivot point right now where you, as a debater, are going to need to guide policy that would be effectively implemented, would address concerns from your member nations, but would also address real world problems and an incredible crisis that is going on right now across the ocean from us. In terms of supportability, you will have an incredible amount of research that you can dig into, and you have an incredible spectrum of ideas. Not only will you get to dig into centuries of what is European politics, but you also get to read from the entire spectrum of political ideologies in terms of how you actually deal with this problem. There's lots of very compelling arguments that you need to work through. You also have to work through how you balance what is theoretically a good idea, which the EU had plenty of, and then practically how that shakes out. And you get to do it in a way that impacts real people. So that's fantastic. That's a great educational opportunity. And there's a lot of literature and a lot of history that you can pull in to support what you're saying. To kind of end it, because I could talk for a while, I just want to land on why I am so excited that this is an option for you. The first reason I'm really excited is because as I've been talking all this time, you'll notice that I have not talked about the United States. And that's because this is not a US-centric actor. You would be acting as the European Union. That will introduce you to an entirely new part of the world. This is world history on steroids for you. This is fantastic. You are going to get to dabble in the best world history course you could ask for in terms of European history. That is incredibly exciting to me. You don't typically get to do that with a foreign policy resolution. Usually it's something that's very country specific, or it's so broad that you can't really narrow down what to focus on. This is a great balance because you get the EU, you get 27 member states, you get a particular organization that you're working as, but you still get to interact with all that political theory. That's fantastic. And secondly, this is a real pressing issue. This is not an immigration crisis that's going away. These are people that for the most part are fleeing either extreme poverty or they're fleeing extreme violence, terrorism, and other atrocities. I mean, the numbers have been pretty consistent for a long time. The EU needs a solution to this. This is a fantastic, very relevant debate for you to have, and it's going to force you to confront immigration issues in a very challenging way. And I think that would be incredibly beneficial for everyone. So with all that being said, I'm pumped about this resolution. If you have questions, I would love to answer them, and I'm sure the board would love to answer them, but I will turn it over to anyone else on the committee that would like to chime in on this awesome resolution that we have.
I also like the change of perspective, being the European Union and dealing with it from a non-US centric point of view. I think the educational value of that is really high and would be an awesome educational opportunity.
I want to read a note from April Sanchez. Just noted this. I just want to throw that out there. Really interesting perspective. She says, yes, hugely important time and topic. What you see in European immigration policy is what you'll see in the United States 20 years later. She says, my husband is an immigration attorney and we've done ministry in Spain for years. This topic is so important. So a couple of really great perspectives on that as well. Thank you, April.
It's wonderful. All right, Ravi, you want to go ahead and introduce our second speaker?
Yes. James, thank you so much. I don't know if y'all could tell at all if James seems a little unexcited about this topic. We're going to feed him some coffee during the other. No, thank you, James. Appreciate that. So we're moving on. The second topic today, you'll hear from Mrs. Melanie Corley. And again, probably a lot of us know her. Melanie earned a business and law degree from the University of Texas at Austin. She works as the president of Aftermath Disaster Recovery. Melanie has 5 children who have or will compete in the NCFCA. She's coached LD and TP for 12 years now. Also loves extemp. So Melanie, thank you for your hard work. It's an absolute joy to work with you. Yeah, so take it away with your topic.
Thanks, Ravi. And I'll say that Ravi is the absolute nicest man to work with, and he's the best team leader ever. So when they asked if I wanted to serve or if I'd be willing to serve on the committee again this year, I said, is Ravi going to lead it? And they said yes. And I was like, okay, then I'm in. So the topic that I am discussing tonight is resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase its development assistance to one or more of the following: Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. So I am super excited about this resolution topic too, even though I might not be as ebullient as James is in his discussion, because I honestly don't know which topic I'm going to vote for. I love all 3 of these topics. I was super excited, and they actually weren't my idea. And so none of them were my baby, but I love where we all ended up. And I like multiple things. One is that they were unique in their perspective and unique in how we approached the resolutions. And there's reasons why we did that. But for this topic, for the Latin America topic, I was really interested in doing a Latin American topic. We haven't done that in the league before. And I find that unusual because they're our neighbors and we are more directly impacted by Latin America than virtually any other place. And so when we came up with this topic, I was just really excited for 3 reasons. One is that it's talking about development assistance specifically. So I think that narrows the scope a little bit, but it is also, there are a lot of things that encompass development assistance. Let's see, development assistance encompasses assistance for agriculture, natural resource management, trade, energy production, promoting good governance, education, social services, water and sanitation, and healthcare. So there's a lot of ground that's covered under development assistance. The other thing that I liked about the resolution was that we're talking about increasing development assistance. And so I like the fact that that narrows the direction from a mom perspective and a coach perspective. I really don't like the little policies that, you know, abolish some small insignificant policy, but it's abolishing. And so that leads into, you know, some favor that no matter what. And anyway, so I like the fact that we're talking about exploring development assistance in a direction, and let's talk about why that's good, why that's bad, and learn about that. The relevance of the topic is so significant to us in the United States. We're in Texas, so it really, really impacts us, but it really does impact the entire United States, in that the Obama administration put Central America high on its foreign policy agenda, and yet in 2019, prior to getting usurped or upstaged by the coronavirus, the mass migration from Central America was in the news almost every day. Now, the only thing that's in the news right now is the coronavirus, so we don't hear about any mass migration issues right now, but once this is over, that will be back in the news again. So highly relevant to us, and it's a crisis to us. It's our southern crisis border, but this crisis, our U.S. crisis, is really just a symptom of the crises that exist in the Northern Triangle countries, which is what the three countries as a group are considered. They're called the Northern Triangle. And so talking about relevance, highly relevant, and in addition to the US crisis, border crisis, we probably have family and friends, coworkers, church friends who have ministries in that area, or who have family members that live there. And that makes it all the more relevant, like really hits home. This topic can really hit home. And so then in terms of breadth, I mentioned already the scope of development assistance and what all that encompasses. So there is a lot of breadth to talk about there. But since the Obama administration put it on a higher priority, the UN has been there since about 2007, trying to improve the situation there. But in those three countries, there is such violence, transnational drug trafficking that goes from South America through Central America, and because of the weak governance that they have in the Northern Triangle, transnational drug cartels have made those the stopping points. And so there's a lot of trafficking, a lot of gang violence, a lot of corruption, and all of that leads to weak governance that is causing crises to us, to Americans, to the United States. So both relevance and breadth of topic, and the supportability is also significant because, like I said, since the Obama administration put it as a priority, we have all of the Obama administration efforts, and then all of the UN efforts, which have been going on for well over a decade and clearly did not work at all, or clearly have not been effective. Since in 2019, over 600,000 migrants came from the Northern Triangle to come to the United States, fleeing food insecurity, fleeing violence, fleeing economic instability, gangs. And they have some of the highest murder rates in the world. So relevance, breadth, supportability, it's all there in this topic that I think is a really awesome topic that is highly valuable to learn about. From a mom's perspective, I like the educational value, but from a debate coach perspective, lots of ground for good plans and a lot of negative ground and a lot of negative ground that can cross apply among the three countries. They're not the same. The countries are different, and they have some exciting politics that are going on in those countries. Like I said, political instability, but they had a newcomer, young guy who was recently elected the president in El Salvador. And so he's super, wanting to change things and wanting to fight crime, and then comes in with the military to do that. And it was like this, coup almost, but he's the leader. So he's bringing this in. And so then people are a little bit in the global community afraid that he's, as authoritarian as some others. And so it's very dramatic and very exciting and relevant to us. If anyone wants to comment, anybody else on the committee for comments that they had about this topic.
Yeah, I just want to echo how interesting development economics is. I think because it's not necessarily part of a lot of economics programs in high school that you're not going to see a lot of it, but like it's an entire subclass of the study of economics is looking at ideas of development. And it's still a hotly debated aspect of economic research. And so there's just, even on the subject of how do you effectively help a country get from an impoverished state to a more prosperous state, is very much something that's written about constantly. So I think that's really exciting.
I agree. And we think of things in terms of our standards. And so if it doesn't look like the American standard, then it's not effective or it's not worthy. But like in Colombia, which is, always been the drug capital of South America and impacts the United States. And I mean, they were essentially a failed state, civil war racked for decades. And I mean, they have made strides. We have helped them make strides. And so it's just interesting to learn about what actually works. And if we can do that, should we?
Very good. Thank you, Brenda. Thanks for the additional info there, Mark, as well. As y'all can tell, again, every person on the resolution committee is quite excited and pumped, not only about their own topic that was assigned to them for further research, but also in general for all of the three that we've put forward. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce the third member of our team policy resolution committee, and just again a power team that we had in place that just I thought we worked together so well and brought in so many of complementary skills and interests, and it was just a joy to work with everybody. So the third member is Marc Davis. Marc has participated in the NCFCA for 6 years, qualifying to nationals in both team policy and extemp. In college, he debated for Grove City College, winning multiple tournaments. Now Marc teaches speech and debate in the Boston area and writes about board games for the thoughtful gamer. What an amazing twist to bring into our debate resolution committee. So Marc, thank you for all your work. Thank you for your input. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about the resolution resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase humanitarian assistance to one or more countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the big things I wanted to see in a resolution choice this year was looking at Africa, because we've gone nearly 20 years in the NCFCA without really looking at Africa, except as a part of the Middle East, those areas up in the Northeast. But specifically looking at Sub-Saharan Africa seems like a hole in kind of where the NCFCA has created topics in the past, because Africa is fascinating. It's massive, just geographically massive. It has one of the longest histories of any place on earth, and is filled with many different peoples and cultures. It's also, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, very war-torn with shifting borders. I remember trying to study the geography of Africa and where the countries are, and I'd have to make sure my maps were up to date because new countries are created and old ones are lost and borders shift over time. It's also one of the most impoverished nations, or it's home to some of the most impoverished nations on earth. Even though poverty and hunger have been alleviated significantly over the past few decades, it's still how Sub-Saharan Africa is still home to some extremely impoverished nations. So just as a geographical area, it's very interesting and very exciting and something we haven't really dug into before. From the perspective of assistance from the United States federal government, that was a big part of George W. Bush's administration. Part of his legacy is that he wanted to make large strides in doing things like alleviating the AIDS crisis and other health and humanitarian issues in Africa. And now we have a chance to look back and see what was effective there, what was not effective, and what can be changed. There are also multiple current conflicts in Sub-Saharan Africa with civil wars, with conflict within countries, between countries, where the United States could change its policy regarding humanitarian aid. So I think it's a very relevant topic. I know George W. Bush sounds like forever ago, but I mean, when we do policies that are supposed to have long-term effects, we want to revisit those policies and see what has changed there, or what can be improved there, and what we can learn from that. I think now is an interesting time to look at humanitarian support in Africa. In terms of the breadth and supportability of the topic, there are a lot of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, but that isn't, I think, necessarily where the variety in the topic is going to come from. We may see affirmatives pinpointing very specific areas of that part of Africa, but I think a lot of cases are going to be broader, just because the principles of humanitarian support and humanitarian aid are broad issues. So there are a number of different theories and arguments over how aid ought to be administered, how it ought to be implemented. Standard operating procedure for USAID, which is the agency in the executive branch that in the United States that delivers aid, is essentially providing money to the recipient government for them to use according to specific guidelines. But that can cause issues when those governments are corrupt or filled with graft and all kinds of things like that. So there are big, broad issues in terms of how aid can be effectively administered. For medicine, there are a number of challenges that can arise when trying to deliver medicine to people that are specific to different cultures and areas geographically. For instance, if there are cultures that have traditionally been very skeptical of modern medicine, how do you give people modern medicine? How do you work with people in that way? With food aid, there's a strong debate over the efficacy of in-kind aid, which is simply just giving food, like actually shipping food over, versus giving money to governments or local groups in order to go towards alleviating hunger. So there are both the specifics in terms of the nations in Sub-Saharan Africa, and there are the broader issues that are going to come into play every round, which I think is very interesting. Affirmative teams can go very specific, they can go broad, but there's always going to be this broad kind of intellectual arguments about how aid ought to be administered, or whether or not aid should be administered at all, whether or not it's right for the United States to provide aid. All that's always going to be open to the negative side to kind of counterbalance the fact that there are a lot of nations in Sub-Saharan Africa. There's also a lot of fertile counterplan ground because the resolution, as like the last one, is unidirectional, which I think is extremely exciting. So like I said before, we haven't had a topic in this area in nearly 20 years. We've had a lot of topics. I remember debating India year way back in the day, where aid was a case that was run, and I got to dig into it a little bit, and I know that just made me more excited to want to look into that more, but the topic was about India as a whole, so I couldn't get into the depth of research that I would have liked there. This resolution is going to allow us to get into the depth of research about humanitarian aid that we've never done before. So that's why I'm really excited about this one. Although echoing everyone else, I'm excited about all three of the topics. I have no idea what I would vote for if I had a vote. That's all I've got. Anyone else have any comments?
I would just like to echo that the depth of research that you would be able to do is a big plus and should not be discounted. There would be a temptation, I think, to say like, wow, this feels really narrow. Don't look at it as being narrow. Like, this is incredible depth that you can get to for what Marc is right, is a fascinating topic. So I think this is a really cool resolution.
Yeah, I think there might be first impressions about which resolutions here are narrow or broad. I think they're probably about the same, honestly.
And I appreciated during our deliberations as well, and even from listening to y'all today, is and the depth comes about because we need to get past the, oh, aid means sending them more money mindset. There's so much more to aid. There's so much more to actually trying to come up with policies that help people in these nations rather than just have an aid package or a policy that gives aid. And I think that's where a lot of the scope and the depth is going to come in.
And if it isn't obvious by the way we've worded the resolutions and how we framed them, I think everyone here who was on the committee will agree that one of our primary goals was to encourage more depth of research with these topics. So if things look maybe a bit unusual to you, that's almost certainly the reason why. We wanted to encourage depth of research, and I think everyone should be excited about that.
Yes, I agree. And like with the foreign aid topic, everybody talks about the money that is, but if we're talking about significance in terms of debate, I mean, the amount of foreign aid that the US gives is insignificant. So if we're framing it that we're just talking about aid, then it's the dollars are in relation to those dollars, because the amount of money that the US gives in foreign aid is, 1% of its federal budget or less than 1% of its federal budget. So in terms of relative to the US budget, it's a very, very small amount of money, but, of course, to me, it would be money. I mean, it'd be a lot of money, but so we're basically wanting to explore the depth of how to make that effective. And almost every place that we give aid is a developing country and struggles because of corruption. And so by definition, that aid, there's a risk of that aid being grafted. So is there a way to make that effective? I think that's interesting. And especially as Christians, I think that's interesting to explore.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Marc. Appreciate it. Great overview of the three topics. So we're going to deviate just a little bit. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning of the session. And so some of the participants were unable to hear James's framing of the EU topic. So we're going to go back to rectify that. And James, if you don't mind, please kind of do another quick review of that topic for us, please.
Oh no, I have to talk about the EU now. Say it ain't so. Oh, what will I do? Okay, so I know a lot of you already heard it, so I'm going to condense it a little bit, but I still want to hit all the pertinent parts for the people who came in late. Don't want you to miss it. So hop in the wagon with me. We'll run back to the beginning and we'll run back through. So the topic that I talked about was the European Union, whether or not it should substantially reform its immigration policy. So first thing I want you to consider is Europe as a whole and a brief history of it, right? So Europe is a story of nations who have developed incredible power. Think like the Great Britain nation that the sun never set on. and then tore themselves apart because there was infighting either within their country or from countries right across the way. So when you think about something like the EU, you need to understand that it's very important for Europe. There's 27 member states in the EU. The idea that you would have cooperation between that many member states is mind-blowing and the result of centuries of negotiations and diplomacy and treaties built one upon another, okay? But right now, the EU is at a crisis point. It's not yet 30 years old, but there's already very public crumblings like Brexit that have illustrated some of its key shortcomings, and immigration is right up there at top as one of its key shortcomings. So let's talk about what the EU does in terms of immigration. Some of you asked questions in the chat, and this re-explanation will actually answer some of them if you didn't catch it the first time. So I'll re-explain it and try to address some. So the EU as an organization has authority over policies that span all 27 member nations. That has to do with internal immigration and third-party immigration. Internal immigration is when you immigrate from one EU nation to another. That's internal within the EU. You can do that very freely. You don't need a whole lot. You just have to be able to prove you're a citizen of an EU nation, and then it's basically open borders. Third-party immigration is if you immigrate from any other nation in the world into the EU. That's third-party immigration. So if I'm in Algeria and I want to go to the EU, I'm a third-party immigrant. They also deal with what we call legal and illegal immigration. They call it regular and irregular immigration. It's essentially the same concept though. Individual member states have some latitude with how they implement the broader EU policies and how they give things like citizenship to people. The EU provides the broader framework. It's supposed to give a framework that's fair and equitable and just and prevents human trafficking and upholds dignity. Most people though would say that they failed, and here's why. Over the last decade, the EU has had over 1 million people every single year as just third-party immigrants from other nations knocking at its borders. And its broader framework policies were not equipped to handle that. So as people come into the nation, you'll see issues like human trafficking. There's literally a backlog of people to get into the nation. Human traffickers will sometimes poach them in transit. You'll also see people inside the EU wave at people from across the way and say, hey, we can get you in. It's going to be a long wait if you try and do it legally. And then they traffic them into various forms of human trafficking. There's also the issue of people dying on the way over. They're so desperate to get away from wherever they're coming from, whether it be war-torn or impoverished, that they literally just die on the way over to the EU. That's a big issue. That's something that the EU can and should rectify if it's within its power to do that. You also have security concerns because you have internal open borders. If someone can get citizenship in any one of the 27 member states, you get a free pass everywhere. So member nations that have very high citizenship requirements are very frustrated at states that have low citizenship requirements, where you can essentially buy your citizenship, because that means France may have all these security mechanisms in place. But if you go to this other EU nation, pay €200 and get yourself citizenship, you can walk right into France. That is splintering the EU apart. That's something that needs to be addressed. Economic ramifications of immigration are always there. That's going to affect your economy in some way, shape, or form. And then there's just national sovereignty. The reason why the EU was such a big deal is because all of those different member nations have fierce national pride for the most part. So the fact that there's an overarching organization that sets policies that all 27 of them follow, that is already a tenuous situation. Like, that's a big deal, and it's really cool that it's happened. But because immigration has become such a problem-infused issue for all of these member states, it's starting to break apart. Brexit was the really public result of what was, in a lot of ways, immigration issues, and the UK pushing back against what it saw as completely unfair burdens that the EU put on it and not on other member nations. This is so cool, guys, because you will get to, first of all, focus on something that's not the US. You're going to be acting as the EU. You are going to get the best tour of European history anyone has ever seen, which is awesome, but it's not going to be overwhelmingly broad. You still are only dealing with the EU. only EU policy, and just when it comes to immigration. So even though you get to touch on all of those issues I talked about, the scope is limited enough to still encourage you to go deep instead of looking for just little things scattered around the resolution. Plus, this is a real world issue, like a real issue. Immigration crises are not going away when it comes to the EU. You are going to get pushed to the forefront of finding a way to balance very tenuous European politics with finding ways to help people who desperately need your help and figuring out where political theory that sounds nice meets cold hard reality. That is a fantastic debate, and I'm super excited for it. And I think I trimmed it down a little bit, so success. Yeah, I'll turn it back over to Ravi. Thank y'all.
Great. Thank you, James. Appreciate that. Appreciate the scrunching down also for time purposes. So, okay. I believe now we have Mrs. Cromer has some giveaways for us to announce. Kim?
I do indeed. Our sponsor this evening is the University of Northwestern at St. Paul, as I told you early on. They are giving away an awesome University of Northwestern swag pack that I have been able to peek into in the past, and it has some really great things inside. And the winner of that wonderful package is Juliana Shepner. So Juliana, if you would email the office at ncfca.org to claim your prize. That's just office@ncfca.org. If you will share your information with us, we'll get that shipped out to you. And the other exciting thing is that every one of you is now entered into a drawing for an iPad that was generously donated by the University of Northwestern. And we will draw for that on Friday after the value debaters have an opportunity to attend their webinar as well. So we will let you know that. We'll make that announcement on social media. And I know you'll be excited to hear that. James did ask if he could win the iPad. And I think maybe after doing the presentation twice, James, maybe we would let you do that. So, okay, very good. So thank you all again for the great information. I have been watching the questions fly in, and so I'm going to hand right back over to Ravi and let you all take off with the questions. How about that?
Will do. Thank you, Kim. Appreciate that. Yes, questions flying in is a good way to put the number of questions we have. So that's exciting. Thank you for all those questions. Obviously, based on time limitations, we're going to be not going to be able to address all of them, but we'll try to get some of them. We've had some amazing people in the back trying to group some of the questions together, and so we'll try to address some of the big ones that have had several questions related to them come in. And I'm going to try and move back and forth. And again, in the interest of time, guys, I know all three of our debate committee members have a lot to contribute to any of these, but I think I'm going to just have the person that worked on that particular topic take each of these questions related to the topics, just because of the interest of time. So let's start with James with TP1. EU, a burning question is about fiat. Can you talk about fiat? And if you would, also talk about, are there differences in fiat between the EU as a whole and the EU nations within the EU?
Yes, so I can. So under the resolution, your fiat power would be over the EU as an organization, right? So the EU in its charter lays out what the EU is allowed to do and also what member states are allowed to do. So you would be able to control anything that the EU could legally tell its member states to do, right? Because you control the EU as a whole. that means that certainly a government, like an individual government, let's say France, could object to something that you're doing as the EU, but in terms of the EU's policy, you can still pass whatever you want. You control the EU. If you wanted to get crazy and say that, well, that means France would pull a Brexit, I mean, cool. I would love to see your reasoning, your evidence, and your analysis, and that's the beauty of debate, and that's probably why you should understand European politics a little bit before you go write your affirmative 30 minutes after this webinar is done. So I would encourage you to read and understand first and then craft policy from there. Did that thoroughly answer that question, Ravi?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Appreciate it. Melanie, moving over to you. Question for you is, why is the resolution only seem to be focused on development assistance?
Well, we chose development assistance because those 3 states are racked with instability, governance issues, food insecurity, violence, gang violence, drug violence. And so in terms of a policy that would get to the heart of what would really solve the issues, we felt like development assistance was it. And that narrowed, our intention wasn't to go too narrow, but it was to define it in such a way to encourage people to go a little bit deeper than what we have seen like the trend be in the past. So we wanted some depth, and we wanted something that would impact those countries and that impact on our crisis at the southern border.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Melanie. Marc, if I could switch over to you, and this actually addresses resolutions 2 and 3. Can you talk about why we specifically used increase in the resolution?
I think, I mean, from my perspective, I don't want to speak necessarily for everyone else, although I think we all kind of agreed on this. The benefit of saying increase instead of opening up to broad policies is that it focuses down the resolution a bit more, so it encourages deeper research. So for instance, now anything relevant to increasing assistance, either resolution, is just affirmative, and anything against the idea of assistance is just negative. It also allows a lot of counterplan ground that we've never seen before, because it can sidestep issues of whether or not topicality is relevant to counterplans. Because if your counterplan is to decrease assistance or not do what the affirmative team is doing and decrease or abolish assistance, that's always going to be non-topical now, which I think is super exciting. It'll open up a bit more freedom, I think, for debaters. I think those are the main 2 reasons. It focuses the debate a bit more and allows for more interesting stuff and just general negative argumentation. So again, even though, like I said, with the Africa resolution, there are a lot of countries, anything related to why we just shouldn't give aid generally on a principled argument, on a pragmatic argument, an indictment of US aid, all of that is always going to be relevant to the negative team.
Okay. Great, thank you. Can we talk about, I don't know who wants to take this, maybe Melanie, you can take this. With resolutions, all of them, but 2 and 3 particularly, what are the advantages to the US, if any?
Well, so there's multiple advantages to the U.S. And in my white paper, I opened with a quote from Senator Friss from Tennessee, and he's a doctor. He's a Republican, but he talked about, as a doctor working in foreign countries, to demonstrate the use of foreign aid. It's not just charity, but that it develops partnerships. So it's an investment. It's an investment in the U.S. So that goes to trade relationships, and especially like with the increase in terrorism, when we can strengthen developing countries, then our risk in those countries becomes lower. So the more stability we have, the greater the return on investment is for the US in terms of trade and our economics, and a decrease in the threat that poses to the US.
Okay, great, fabulous. James, there are several questions, I think, related to the orange and yellow card provisions. Would you speak to that, please, with the EU resolution?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. If you don't know what the yellow and orange card provisions are, it's in a very simplified nutshell, the ability of EU member states to petition the European Commission, which is their parliament, and say, hey, you know, this provision that you passed kind of violates our own national directives, so could you reconsider it? Then under EU law, the parliament has to consider it, has about 8 weeks to do that, and has to give a reason why it's either rejecting its own policy or believes it actually falls in line with what the member nation wanted. With that in mind, keep in mind that the final vote that is deciding whether or not the policy is adopted happens within the EU Commission. That is something the EU controls. Also keep in mind, if you're concerned about that the yellow card provision has been used a grand total of 3 times. So if you have a legitimate reason to say that a case is going to violate that and you want to talk about the yellow card provision, you're welcome to give that a shot and then talk about how that would precipitate something like the UK leaving. But that's good grounds for debate, and that's really hard to do. Like you would have to propose some radical policies to make people utilize a provision that's been used 3 times in history and has never been escalated to the orange card, which is where there's a vote to see if the majority of people in the parliament reject it. That's literally never happened. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it from a fiat power perspective.
Great, thank you. Melanie, would you address, there are also several questions related to your topic, talking about why do we only have the 3 countries in the resolution? What about the other countries?
The other countries in Central America?
Yes.
So we talk about the Northern Triangle countries as a group. It started out as a trade term. And then now we just talk about it in terms of these 3 countries because they are more unstable than the other Central American countries. Not to say that there's not, poverty in the other Central American countries, but these 3 countries are like number one murder rate in the world, number 4 murder rate in the world, and then I can't remember which one it was that's cut it in half. I think Guatemala has cut their murder rate, or Honduras has cut their murder rate in half, but it's still number 16 in the world. So these 3 countries, because of their weak governance, has been just a larger target for the transnational drug cartels and the gang violence and the instability that makes them just crazy violent over some of the other Latin American countries or over Central American countries. So that's why. And, it's kind of unruly to have 8 or 10 countries listed in your list of countries, but in terms of relevance, the impact to the US is specifically coming from those 3 countries.
Okay, thank you. Marc, would you address a little more, give us a little more of a scope on when we talk about helping the Sub-Saharan countries, what kind of things could we be considering? What are some of the big areas?
In terms of types of aid,
Mm-hmm.
I think the main ones are going to be food and medicine in terms of humanitarian aid. You could potentially talk about shelter specifically if there are refugee issues. You could talk about shelter as well, but most of the time it's discussed in terms of food and medicine. Where I think you get a lot of options and a lot of interesting topics is obviously in what food and medicine, how do you implement it, and where. So the excitement of the topic is again in the detail.
Okay, well,
Oh, I think he's back.
So I think the excitement with this is with the details. Again, much like development assistance, it's going to be a lot of solvency argumentation, which I think is exciting, along with disadvantages and significance and all that good stuff. But I mean, it's a lot in the details of how do we implement food or medicine or refugee supplies, where do we do it, how much do we, like, to what scale do we do it, and then of course broader questions of whether or not that's something the United States federal government should be doing, and stuff like that. So I think it's in the details of how you, I mean, I remember back in India year, there was a team running a case dealing with giving out or funding this one particular company's like protein mixture that was like super calorically dense and was a complete protein, and they argued it was going to be super effective, and there were a lot of good argumentation there. I loved researching against that case because there are issues of cost, there are issues of efficacy, there are issues of whether or not you could actually implement it correctly where people were getting the correct dosage of what they needed. All kinds of fun debate there when you really dig into the details, and I think that's what we're going to see.
Okay.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So there are actually a couple of questions that are sort of related. Melanie, if you could address this, and in fact, one of the questions specifically addresses something you said when you talked about your topic, that said, you said some automatically vote for abolishing programs. Doesn't that mean that the neg has a bias? And this really kind of goes towards both the second and third resolutions. Maybe you can address it and then Marc can come in as well, either way. But do y'all feel that there would be a bias on neg? And if not, why not?
Okay, so I have opinions about bias. And I work in the region formerly known as 4. I've worked in the tab room for a long time. And so because I am a nerd, I would take down, like each round, I would just write down, just for grins, okay, the number of AFs and the number of negs that win. Because every year the kids are all, oh, there's bias. Oh, everybody has a bias. And so I start writing it down and I tally. And at the end of the day, all of the concerns about bias really go away. The numbers that, like, we have a filter that the input that we receive supports the predisposition that we already have, but in fact, the numbers don't bear that out. So what I have found is that good debaters win their rounds, and he with the most knowledge wins. So the bias is overcome by the depth of knowledge and the depth of research, and then how effectively they can communicate that. But he with the most preparation wins the rounds most always.
Yeah, and I know this was years ago, but I know people who looked at AFNEG bias and resolutions, and they said the largest they ever saw was like a 53-47 split percentage. Like, it just doesn't exist with policies that are this broad. The only time I've seen that happen is in parliamentary debate in college, where the resolutions are often extremely specific. Like, when they point to exactly one case that can be run, sometimes you'll see some 65-35 splits in a round, but even that's a small sample size. That'll be among 30-40 teams. The idea that one resolution is going to be affirmative or negative bias just isn't going to be true, because the resolutions are broad enough that you can creatively get around what biases you perceive exist. There may be biases against the particular case you selected, but that's a good problem to have, right? When we're talking about overcoming the biases of judges, and trying to recognize what kind of preconceptions and assumptions the judges have and overcome that, that's precisely what we want to learn how to do. That's a good problem. But in terms of a resolution having an AF or neg bias, it just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and one of the things I want to kind of bring sort of a little more of a general idea, I think, and I know all of us would agree, is to encourage / challenge our debaters, parents, coaches, to not just think about this as a game that uses very just strategic and tactical ways to win a round. All these topics have some incredible real world problems.
Mm-hmm.
How can we come up with policies that ends up helping people in these different parts of the world? How can we think about policies that will actually help the people? And I can pretty much guarantee you come up with cases that does that, you will be very, very persuasive to the judges. Mm-hmm. on either side, whichever side you're on. So I would just say, please keep that in mind. I mean, I am just, all of us in the committee, and I can speak for myself very much. I am just amazed at the opportunities that you have to learn about real world problems, real people in different parts of the world that we can actually do something about by making policies, good policies. And that's really the challenge that I think I want to present to you. James, Mark, Melanie, anybody else have anything to add to that perspective?
I'll throw in just a little bit. So I think I'm the most recent debater to have graduated, even though that wasn't like yesterday, that was a bit ago. I know bias is frustrating. Like when you read a ballot and you get it and you're like, wow, like on the flow, I really feel like I should have won. And it's very easy to walk away from those rounds genuinely frustrated. And I get that, I really do. I would really like y'all to understand though, that as someone who was very frustrated about those ballots, now on the backside of it, those were the most helpful ballots for me in terms of the real world, because you get out in the real world and there is no curated judge pool for you. Like you don't get to talk about non-biased topics. If you want to represent Christ in the world, especially in the workplace, you just don't get that. You have to learn how to take someone who implicitly disagrees with you, scaffold your way to agreement without compromising the truth, stand firm, and to be persuasive. That is difficult. And all the ballots you get that are illustrating how difficult that is to you, that's a challenge that you need to embrace, not just discount, because it's unfair. That's the world, and that's the greatest opportunity. So be excited about that.
Great. Thank you. Great questions. I believe we have come to the end of our Q&A time. So Kim, let me hand it over to you and let us know where we're going to go from here.
That sounds great. Thank you all again. We are gonna be able to stay around, I think, about 5 more minutes to answer just a few more questions, because we do have quite a list. You guys have been very active. But first, I want to introduce you to our Director of Education, Mrs. Amy Joy Tofty, who is going to tell you about some really exciting opportunities that are coming up in the next few days. Amy Joy?
Thank you, Kim. So we do have some really exciting opportunities. Obviously, on Thursday night, we're going to have another webinar very similar to this one with our Value Debate Committee. And so I would encourage you, come back for that. Learn about the other style of debate and learn about those resolutions as well. Next week, we are so blessed. The Heritage Foundation has secured scholars to talk about each one of these resolutions. So you can join us again on Monday and Thursday nights. So Monday for policy and Thursday for Lincoln Douglas Value Debate. And so you'll be receiving information about that in the newsletter tomorrow, and there'll be registration links for that. And just to remind you that the voting for the resolutions closes on Friday, May 1st at 11:59 p.m. Central Time. So don't miss out on that. We are so excited to provide all these learning opportunities for you. They will all be recorded and they will be available in the resource library. There are many other exciting things going on. You can go to the website at ncfca.org and you can click on spring events. And there are many other things such as the book club, UNWSP, University of Northwestern is going to be sponsoring a webinar on how to pay for college. That is a topic that is on all of our hearts and minds right now. So join us for that as well. And with that said, I do want to thank you all for attending tonight. Our debate committee has volunteered to stick around just for a little while longer. So if you have really specific questions that you want to ask them, you are welcome to do so either in the chat box or live.
Thank you all. Appreciate you being here.
Great. So Ravi, are you, could you hit just a few more questions maybe that folks might still have for us?
Yeah, I can stick around as long as I got nothing to do.
That's great. Thank you, Marc. We're not going to take you up on that because I know these kids and they will stay here until midnight.
Bring it on.
Bring it on. That sounds wonderful. But I thought there might be a few more, Ravi, that you'd like to hit for maybe about 5 more minutes.
Okay. Okay. Anybody really, whoever wants to, can jump in here and address it. Is as far as actually giving the aid to the nations, what is the mechanism? Some debaters want to know. Would we be giving it to an NGO? Would we be giving it to a private organization? How would the mechanics of that work?
Up to the AF team. I mean, currently most aid is given through U.S. aid to, like I said, the government of the country we're trying to give aid to, and then it's earmarked for specific things. But I mean, the U.S. has invested in PPPs, public-private partnerships. We've helped NGOs. There's all kinds of routes you could pick there. There's questions about topicality. I mean, honestly, it's if you can defend it. Like, none of us are equipped, and no one should be equipped to tell you what is topical or not.
Topicality, I find every year everybody thinks, oh, this is all gonna be topicality arguments, and that doesn't materialize as much as people think it does either. I always coach the kids, okay, give me 3 topicalities against this case. Great, now never use those, but I'm glad you identified them.
Right. Well, and I think at this time of the year, it's really tempting to say, oh, the second and third topic are very similar, or it seems like this is going to be very narrow, or only this type of case is going to win based on our judge pool. I think the reality is, Marc, what you said is true. I mean, NCFCA we have our own statistician, and we were running when our season ended about 49-51. And even that decimal point would flip just a little bit, so that we were often about 50-50, with the exception of sometimes the first tournament of the season. And that's, sort of to be expected.
There's always an arc, right? As teams get more prepared. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
James, if we could go back to you with the EU topic, could you talk a little more about fiat and again, in terms of the resolution, can debaters pass a bill from the EU itself as well as from one of the EU states? Are both of those okay, or can you just talk about that?
So it's just the EU. So you can pass something through the EU Parliament and enforce it through EU mechanisms. You cannot act as France's national government to do anything. You could, from the EU's perspective, talk about, well, France as a nation might react this way to our policy, but everything is focused on the EU and the EU's perspective. What should the EU as a governing body do within its power?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Something I meant to, and I forgot, my apologies. I wanted to really talk about this. Well, actually, I think I did. Sorry. It's been a long day. Maybe worth mentioning again, just be a little aware of adult topics that are going to come up when you're researching these resolutions. I think you're going to hit them in all three. Our debate team can answer that, confirm or deny that. But most certainly, I know James very specifically pulled out human trafficking issues that are going to come up in your research when you're researching the EU immigration topic. So any of you want to talk about that? James, you want to hit that, and then the others can?
Sure. So with the EU in particular, you're mainly honestly going to be looking at human trafficking. Like that's what it's going to talk about. So you'll read reports from like Human Rights Watch, for example, or other nonprofits or watchdogs that have observed the EU's processes. They've looked at the holes, and they will tell you exactly what's happening. Like X number of people are being sold into X type of slavery. Like, you know, they lay it out very factually. I wouldn't say that it's overly graphic. It's just that you have to interact with the fact that human beings are depraved and sinful, and they do some pretty nasty stuff. So I would worry less about graphic material and more about the fact that you just kind of have to come face to face with that.
Yeah.
In the Northern Triangle, we talked, there's definitely the human trafficking issue, and we mentioned drugs, but there's a lot of violence. And so in reading some of the news reports, I mean, the violence is really terrible. So that's something that you could come across.
Yeah, similar in Africa. I mean, obviously there are war-torn areas. You're probably going to read about what it's like for someone to starve to death, which is pretty horrific, since we're dealing with people who are starving. So probably stuff along the same lines.
Yeah.
Ravi, thank you and your team for all the time that has gone in. We will also pull all the questions together. If there are some outstanding issues that we were not able to address, then we will see what we can do to help you all with that. I would also echo Mrs. Tofty's admonition that you all prep that information for next week with Heritage Foundation. I think those specific things that you all were pointing out in your research is going to come out from those scholars who spend literally all day, every day studying the Northern Triangle. So if you're tempted to think, oh, that's narrow, or Sub-Saharan Africa is narrow, there are people that's all they do all day, every day. So it'll be an exciting time to get to spend with them. There was one question, and I'm going to kind of bounce this back to our team as well. I know that there are a couple of groups of people who publish source books each year. And I know there was a question about, or a statement about lasting impact. James, I believe you all are doing a source book, is that right?
Yes, it's about to go live on social media too. Get hyped. It's going to be fantastic.
Great. That's fantastic. Is anybody aware of other source books that are going to be out there? Okay. I'm not really aware of others either. Maybe I'll do a newsletter article about source books and the value of those and how they can help you, and how you're really still bound to do the work yourself. So that's a good opportunity. But I know we'll share that information with you as we get it. So thank you all. You all have a great night.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you, Ravi. Good night,
Marc.
James.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Have a great evening.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
To clarify,